Over 100,000 websites, roughly 4% of the entire internet, from major corporations to small blogs, were unknowingly serving malicious code. How did a seemingly innocuous web service become a vehicle for widespread attack? The story of POLYFILL.io is a wake-up call for anyone who builds or even uses the internet. This is the Intrusions in Depth podcast. I'm Josh Stepp. You and, well, almost everyone interacts with the surface of the internet. The websites, apps, the content. But beneath that surface lies a massive, invisible infrastructure of shared resources, snippets of code, and interconnected services. Layers and layers of code that you or anyone you know didn't write. Open source libraries, third-party ad networks, content delivery networks, or CDNs, delivering essential files, all without any notification to you. But what happens when one of those trusted links is compromised? The 2024 POLYFILL.io incident gave us a glimpse of what that could look like. Now, this was a service designed to make websites work across different browsers, and it was taken and weaponized, pushing malware to the visitors of numerous websites. It highlights a critical challenge. How do we secure the global digital ecosystem built on components that we don't control? Also, there's aspects of open source not being great for everything, and the financial motivations of open source maintainers. Sprinkle in some conspiracy adjacent details, and we have an Intrusions in Depth episode after all. In today's show, I talk about the POLYFILL.io attack, the odd series of events that led up to that and kind of what happened afterwards, and the broader fragile trust of the internet, which kind of sounds weird saying that there's a fragile trust of the internet as a partially jaded blue teamer for almost a decade now. But first, let's not get sued.
The information presented in this show is sourced from publicly available materials and does not contain any classified or proprietary content. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests alone and do not reflect the official policy or position of their employers or any affiliated organizations. Enjoy the show.
Let's start this episode off with a bang, an unpopular opinion of sorts. The modern web is unnecessarily complex and bloated. Many things could simply be HTML and CSS on a static page. Another unpopular opinion: on such sites, you don't even need TLS. Okay, now I know a whole bunch of people are losing their mind. But one example of this is like the Berkshire Hathaway website. And I'll link through to it, but you should check it out. But they aren't struggling, and their website doesn't cause like my MacBook Pro to sound like a Russian Mi-17 busted cargo helicopter. Oh, and if anyone doesn't really understand that reference, those dumpster fires are like the sketchiest things flying in the Middle East. I mean, I get it to some extent. People want to monetize their work, which ads appear to be the best way to do this. Server cost and hosting costs, they all add up. And for some, it's a source of income. And even from a corporate world perspective, you need metrics so you can build KPIs and prove your worth as a marketing team or a content creator. But this comes at a cost. Not everyone uses the same browser. These days, most of the major players in the browser world can do many of the same things, but it wasn't always like that. It took time to get there. In that time, though, web developers wanted to explore new functionality, so they needed a way to emulate this behavior on Internet Explorer. I mean, old browsers. And this is where polyfills enter the picture. And let's clear up some confusion right off the bat. As I found researching this episode, polyfill is used in a wide array of products. There's polyfill used in construction that I would call spackle. I guess other parts of the world call it spackle polyfill or polyfill. There's also the stuffing that's found in like kids' toys, like stuffed animals. That's also considered polyfill. And in Mozilla, in the developer network, the MDN, they see them as generic pieces of code, usually JavaScript, that provide modern functionality to older browsers that don't natively support it. That's what I'm talking about today. It's not apparent. I'd probably see like a huge drop in my audience if I spent an hour talking about Spackle. Now, specifically, what I'm talking about is the POLYFILL service project, which is what was delivering the malicious payloads. And it was originally created by Andrew Betts and Jake Champion. And it was developed by the Financial Times web team approximately 15 years prior to the 2024 incident. Now, for a considerable period, it was a trusted resource in the web development community. The service operated by dynamically generating and delivering the necessary JavaScript polyfills based on the user agent of the requesting browser, ensuring that only the required code was loaded. Now, this convenience led to its widespread adoption, with estimates suggesting its use on over 100,000 websites at the time of the attack. And some figures indicate that it could be even higher, potentially impacting a significant percentage of the internet, almost 4%. After its initial development by the Financial Times, the project transitioned to community management. It was an open source project, a project in which people maintained it in their free time. Like most useful pieces of code, people started using it in their projects, though. In the case of POLYFILL, there were some big players. Intuit, the makers of TurboTax and a bajillion commercials from January to April, as well as the WEF, the World Economic Forum, the Eats the Bugs, 15-minute cities for climate change, and the people that fly into Davos on private jets. Those people. Oh, and don't worry, it's not conspiracy time, so put away your tinfoil hats. Now, where things start going off the rails was when this service, the domain and the corresponding GitHub account, was sold to a Chinese CDN company called Funnel. Now, this acquisition raised immediate concerns, as evident by an X post or Twitter post from one of the developers named Andrew Betts. Betts was the original developer, or one of them. There's some conflicting information out there, but it's not really important. But Betts warned the users to remove polyfill.io immediately, stating that, quote, "I created the POLYFILL service project, but I've never owned the domain name and I have no influence over its sale," end quote. Betts further noted in another X post that no website today requires any of the polyfills in the polyfill.io library, suggesting that modern browsers render the service obsolete. This early warning, issued months before the attack, was publicized and kind of highlighted the potential risk of the domain change, even before anything was actually seen. Adding to that, there was also further issues and further concerns within the GitHub project for the GitHub account on that POLYFILL project. However, we need to be realistic here. How many people follow web developers for a CDN script they use at their corporate job? How many times have you looked at the issues in a GitHub repo when you weren't having issues yourself? I would venture to say that not many people saw these warnings. Additionally, there's an aspect of not even knowing if POLYFILL is in your project to begin with. As we'll discuss a little bit later, there's not a great mechanism to get this information out. But for now, let's go into the timeline of the attack and hit some of the key events. I've recently been contributing to an upcoming book on a fictional state-sponsored threat, and it's been a lot of fun making this story more realistic. I've really enjoyed this experience, and I'm open to collaborating more. Like that project, I was discovered via this podcast. So if you're looking for contributors for a project you're working on, feel free to reach out to me. I have a forum on my website at IntrusionsInDepth.com to sync and collaborate there. I'd love to hear from you. In May of 2023, the Financial Times transferred ownership of the project to an individual named Jake Champion. According to the press release, this took effect on June 2023. Now here's a quote so you don't have to go to the page. Quote, "After almost a decade supporting the POLYFILL service, the Financial Times has decided it can no longer continue to provide the support it needs. We have therefore made the decision to transfer ownership to Jake Champion, who, at Financial Times and Fastly, has been the core maintainer for most of the POLYFILL service's life. He will continue to support its development with input from the community of other long-standing contributors. Hosting will continue to be provided free of charge by Fastly." End quote. Then, in October of 2023, The POLYFILL website announced that they had proudly been sponsored by Fastly. And furthermore, they touted some metrics, saying that they upgraded the web for 39.3 billion requests and served 201.47 terabytes of polyfills over the last 30 days. Those aren't small numbers. Then, in December of 2023, Jake Champion made a series of edits to remove his name from the GitHub repo and replaced it with polyfill.io maintainers. Specifically, there was a change from, quote, report the security issues to the project maintainers directly at polyfill@jakechampion.name, and it was switched to report the security issues to the project maintainers directly at admin@polyfill.io. As well as there was some find and replace Jake Champion with Polyfill maintainers in the legal portions of the project. Then, in early 2024, a new GitHub account was created called Polyfill and took ownership of the Polyfill service repo. Now, this acquisition of the domain cdn.polyfill.io and the GitHub repo took place in February of 2024. There were a number of posts about suspicious events, but it wasn't until January 24th, 2024, where security firm Sansec published an advisory explaining how it was injecting malware into scripts served by mobile users. Now, this was a clever piece of code and made detection difficult. The malware dynamically generated based on HTTP headers and employed some sophisticated evasion techniques, like using a fake Google Analytics account to redirect mobile users to sports betting sites and sometimes pornography. It would also only be activated on specific mobile devices at certain hours and would delay execution if certain services were detected. Around the same time, related domains, active since June of 2023, such as bootcdn.net and staticfile.org, were also implicated, suggesting they were part of the broader campaign, as noted by Hacker News. I'll link through to all of this as well. On June 27, 2024, 3 days after the attack had kind of been outed by Sansec, Namecheap, the domain registrar, put the domain on hold, temporarily eliminating the risk. Google also blocked ads for the e-commerce sites using the compromised service, notifying advertisers and instructing them to remove the service. And then other CDNs and more reputable ones also stepped in to remediate the issue. Cloudflare rolled their own real-time rewrites of cdn.polyfill.io and linked to their own mirror, as detailed in the Cloudflare blog that I'll link to as well. While Fastly offered alternatives as well. Now, in response, post-attack, Funnel, the company operating the Polyfill service, claimed that it was a defamation on their expos and asserted, quote, someone has maliciously defamed us. We have no supply chain risk because all content is statically cached, end quote. And then they relaunched polyfill.com. And as expected, they got ratioed and dog walked by the X community for these absurd claims. Paul has put out a pretty good ad for VMDR scanner in the form of a blog post that indicates a timeline for this attack and more domains that were highlighted. Essentially, it refuted everything that Funnel had said. Then, ultimately, on June 28th, 2024, the site was permanently removed while Funnel attempted to bring back various polyfill.com variants to keep up their scam or attack. Their service. And it appears Funnel was financially motivated, as evident by how the Chinese do things, and there may have been some intelligence gathering for the government sprinkled in there as well. I don't want to rehash this twice, as one of my most recent podcasts, China Strategic Chessboard, or something along those lines, episode 6.2, goes hard in the paint for all of this, and it's over an hour long. So if you're kind of interested in how China fits into this, that's a good place to start. And now, I think this is a good time where I go into the section of the show where I try to get myself canceled. It's called Conspiracy Time.
It's conspiracy time. Tinfoil hats stuck on our heads, following trails that intertwine. Where do they lead? Believe it or not, we'll see.
Okay, so this one is pretty weak and it's a bit of a tease. Full disclosure, I really just wanted to play that song. However, there are some oddities with Polyfill that I think should be brought up. And I'm only going by what appears to have happened based off of GitHub commits from the Internet Archive and just other posts. And I want to make it clear that I'm not concluding there was any malice or wrongdoing here on anyone. Well, except for Fennell. They were doing some seriously suspect things, and I think it's been proven that they were up to no good. Obviously, dropping malware on people is frowned upon, generally speaking. Now, essentially, though, I think it's clear that sometime between October 2023 and December 2023, Jake Champion decided to sell the site to Fennell. Well, I guess to be precise, Jake sold it to someone in December-ish, and the deal with Fennell happened in February of 2024, the following year. And then there's like Fastly being involved, and I don't know what they had to do with being in the sale, but it's, I don't know, a little weird that it's like two CDN companies. I don't know exactly the whole dynamics behind the CDN market, but it just seems odd that they were hosting it and then they were part of the remediation efforts, etc. And I think this is a good time to pause and think about how this works, especially in the wider context of how the internet really works. Think about how many open source projects like POLYFILL are leveraged in the internet ecosystem today. The ecosystem used by some of the most sophisticated, profitable businesses in the world. The software supply chain of sorts. I recently just saw an article that I'll link through that was talking about some of the standard library functions in Go or Golang having ties to some sketchy Russian developers or Russian connections. But let's take a look at like something a little more documented. Let's look at Equifax. And I'm going to try and keep this brief and not a rant, but this needs to be explained. Equifax in 2017 got wrecked. I mean, breached. Breached for my more sophisticated audience. And roughly 145 million people's personal information was disclosed without their permission. And this is social security numbers, addresses, driver's license numbers, basically anything that you would use to apply for credit. Now, Equifax, for my non-American listeners, is one of the 3 credit bureaus in the United States that people use to apply for credit. It's essentially a monopoly between them, TransUnion, and Experian. And these are all credit reporting agencies. Now, I have some gripes over them not really being required to ensure the data that they collect is correct, but we'll get there. You could also add secured, but it is what it is. Now, their product is aggregating, storing, and analyzing data, then selling access to that data via credit reports, scores, analytics to businesses, lenders, and I guess occasionally customers. They make a lot of reports just kind of talking about credit trends. Now, to be precise, I went back and did some research on the stock price as well back in 2017 to further hammer this point home. In 2017, Equifax, a publicly traded company, had a revenue of approximately $3.36 billion. Now, pre-breach, August 2017, using the average stock price of a few days, it was somewhere close to $146.39 per stock. And with almost 120 million shares, Equifax market cap was in the neighborhood of $17.62 billion. So with all of this being said, Equifax failed to secure consumer data when they failed to apply a 2-month-old patch for a security vulnerability in Apache Struts. And let's back up and talk about what Apache Struts is. And they didn't come out and directly point the finger at Apache. And I think Apache did a great job defending themselves here. But Equifax did imply some shifty messaging, saying things like, quote, vulnerabilities in widely used software, like Struts, was a systemic issue. And I think someone told them about the Apache license prior to them testifying in Congress. But then they proceeded to scapegoat one IT worker as the main contributing factor in front of Congress. And I think it's important to point out, too, that Apache Struts is an open source free offering from Apache. So they literally pay nothing for it. And Equifax implied that the breach was partially due to the challenges of maintaining systems like Struts as well. And I get it. Struts isn't the easiest thing to update. It's kind of buried in most apps. However, if you have one job, collecting people's data, securing people's data should be pretty high on that list of responsibilities. I think it's fair to expect that they figure that out. Or maybe they invest in a system they could manage. Or here's a crazy idea. You could donate some of that $3.36 billion in revenue to the Apache Foundation to make the free product that you're using better. Give back a little. And as far as I can tell, none of that happened. And I know this happened quite a few years ago, and I think the credit agencies kind of woken up and kind of taken the stuff more seriously. And with that, I think that gets my point across. But these free frameworks are used by everyone, even in high-value applications. People think that open source is automatically better because, quote unquote, a ton of people look at the code. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it's not many. Sometimes it's only one or two. And sometimes that one or two people that do look at it decide that they want to sell the project to recoup some of the hours, days, years they spent on it in their free time, fixing bugs after working their day job. And I'm all in on open sourcing as much as possible and people getting paid for the benefit that they're delivering to others. I think the community benefit also to trying to leave the world a better place than how you found it, it's amazing. It's how I roll as well. But you need to understand your threat model, first of all. Second, do your research on how well-funded open source is. If you need something super secure so you can make billions of dollars, it probably makes sense to fund the project to some level so you know it's better for you, so you know what you're getting. Maybe buying the enterprise option, supporting it, licensing, utilizing professional services. These are all things that you could do. And I guess while you're at it, maybe making it easier to update for 2-month-old patches in your organization is something you should consider. Or going with something huge that has a team of developers and a monetization strategy. Like if the project's being used by the DoD or a wealthy nation's government, something that they have paid for and vetted with licenses themselves. And this isn't a perfect strategy. Nothing is. But it's a decent model to use when you're evaluating if you should leverage third-party open source or kind of rolling your own. Chances are that the auditors have reviewed the code if it's used in something super secure, and that's probably a good metric to start with. Now, the POLYFILL project wasn't really well funded, and it's kind of obsolete in modern terms, but it lingers. And it offers a perfect vector to sneak in on some long-forgotten code and start serving up malware. And I bet there's hundreds of possible other vectors just like this. Then, if you also consider browser extensions too, kind of being like this, who maintains the browser extension? Do you know when they sell it? And what about those dank Microsoft code extensions that everyone uses? Who maintains those? Do they let you know when they sold their company? Or when the extension code base has changed hands? Now, I'm honestly shocked this doesn't happen more. And it's kind of why I wanted to make this episode. And it appears that GitHub doesn't send a notification to the followers when a repo has changed hands either. Not that I think that would have a huge impact, but it could be something. And with Fastly sponsorship, to which level I don't know, but it seems odd that this sale would even be allowed to go through, especially to a Chinese company, one with rumors of alternative business practices. I'm all for commerce and consider myself pretty libertarian on this front. But for something this impactful, there probably needs to be some type of safeguards in place. I think the libertarian views on this kind of fall apart when we introduce bad faith actors in this equation. Like in this case, Chinese companies that likely have members of the CCP on their board. I think an easy test when it comes to foreign nationals owning property or companies is 1, can Americans own companies in their country? 2, are these foreign nationals citizens of a sanctioned country? 3, does this foreign nationals country have published vision statements like death to America or calling for genocide or hating Americans? I feel like this could be a good start and we could work out some of the others on a case-by-case basis. So what does the guardrails look like for when this occurs though? Maybe opting into new domains sounds like a good place to begin. And then again, it probably wouldn't have been as profitable if it didn't have the user base. And what this boils down to is, I think there should have been better notifications when purchases like this go through. There should be some type of forcing function to accept the notification. Break the polyfills until the developers change to the new CDN. let the users put in issues or support tickets to get fixed, and thus the developers will pay attention to what's in their code. And plus, with modern browsers, no one would have probably noticed if you broke it to begin with. But all of this would also make the sale less profitable, which I guess highlights one of the issues with open source economic models again. Now, before we wrap up, let's discuss the actual malware they deployed, though. Now, I want to take this time to take a closer look at the actual malware itself. And I think this is a great time to express some biases and my own opinions and skill sets. I recently saw this X post about someone who scraped off used gum from various places, and then they washed it, molded it, and made it look like brand new gum, complete with its own foil and printed label, and then put it on a shelf. And holy crap, that's disgusting. And I think if you did sell this, or you even did this, you probably deserve a life sentence in prison. I'm not kidding. It's really freaking gross. And in that same vein, I feel that anyone writing malware in JavaScript deserves the same treatment, especially the really good malware devs that write in JavaScript to make their spaghetti code even more obfuscated and more confusing. Stupid variables, dynamic text generating, encoding, stupid eval environmental checks everywhere, dynamic code fetching. Pretty much anytime I see the word eval, I cringe when I'm looking at JavaScript. And I know it's my own shortcomings based off of a deep-seated hatred for JavaScript that leads to all of this. But it's a real pain in the... Admittedly, ChatGPT, Grok, Gemini definitely makes dealing with JavaScript payloads more manageable. But like every AI system, you can't blindly trust their outputs. You got to verify it. Oh, and Java malware kind of falls into this like second place for categories of malware that I hate. Maybe they just deserve like 10 years in prison, not a life sentence. Sure, it's usually pretty easy to get it back to its source or close to the source via like the bytecode, or if you're on Android, the DEX code. But then you're stuck reading Java. And I think that's the reason Log4j wasn't earth-shadowing. Attackers saw that it was Java and they were like, I'm going to wait for the PSC and the Metasploit payload to drop before I start messing with this. However, by what could have happened standards, this was relatively benign. The malware's main purpose was just to redirect users, especially mobile users, to malicious sites such as sports betting platforms and adult content sites, pornography. Now, this redirect is facilitated through fake domains. The main one was called Googie Analytics, mimicking legitimate service Google Analytics. The L in Google was an I in Googie. And I just like saying the word Googie. Now, the code employed some sweet evasion methods to avoid detection. It activates only under specific conditions, such as certain times of the day and on particular mobile devices, and doesn't execute for admin users. It also delays execution if web analytics services are detected, enhancing its ability to bypass security measures and attention from those sites. Look, I've said it before on multiple episodes, but mobile malware is a tough place to thrive. Even the quasi-legitimate malware developers, surveillance companies, have a hard time keeping their exploits away from Project Zero, Apple, and even places like Citizen Lab. And for the developers of this alternative software, they also have a difficult time between like closed ecosystems and just crash dump analytics being sent off in the form of telemetry. So by having these parameters in place for evading detection, this would, in theory, allow their operation to last longer. Now, adding to the complexity, it dynamically generated payloads based off of HTTP headers, allowing for greater degrees of obfuscation and even some targeted attacks. Now, the tailored responses were based on user agent, device type, and the page referrer. And there's also like the local device time had some input on some of the scripts. And because of all these different variables, it's incredibly difficult to get a full understanding of the entire picture of this operation, as well as mapping out all of the attack infrastructure. Like I said, I've included the Sansec report in the show notes. They've done a great job pulling together most of these scripts and making it readable. Now, this report also highlights some of the main events and the timeline, as well as some more IOCs. I like that they kept the Chinese named functions too. keeping the Chinese word for jump as a function name is very helpful. I would encourage any malware author listening to this to adopt the same practice of using function names and variables that make sense. Instead of using letters and numbers and trying to pretend like you're like a math scholar, and just use like what the function actually does and what the variable actually does. And everyone that has to look at it will appreciate that. I did this episode as I think third-party supply chain attacks are something that doesn't get talked about enough. And I know this is kind of off the rails from what I usually talk about, but I think it's worth talking about broader and putting it out there in front of important people. Sure, when SolarWinds is out there shipping malware, or these big orgs publish their tabletop exercises on what Chinese TikTok supply chain attacks could look like, that impact gets noticed. Important people discuss it. People put it in their risk registers or their PowerPoints to the C-level. But for these smaller projects, even those that affect 1%, 2%, 5% of the internet as a whole, that's still a large number. Scale matters. This tale is a sobering case study in the vulnerabilities inherent in the modern web's sprawling interconnected infrastructure. Now, what began as like a trusted open source service designed to deliver JavaScript polyfills and ensure cross-browser compatibility for hundreds of thousands of websites transformed into a widespread malware distribution network after its domain and GitHub repository were sold to a Chinese company. And this was a very sophisticated campaign, although it wasn't really impactful from what we can tell. And all of this without any real warning to those utilizing the service. And once again, I'm not trying to imply the developers didn't try. They just don't have a big enough platform for this to matter. People rarely check the GitHub issues for projects they aren't having issues with, and virtually no one follows devs for open source projects they may or may not use on X or LinkedIn. The platforms are reserved for like world star videos and inspirational quotes after all, or complaining about how hard their life is. However, FFmpeg on X is a great follow. That's the best social media presence ever for a command line tool that's essentially used everywhere. But in all seriousness, there's some systemic issues that aren't easy to fix that needs to be thought about. First, there needs to be more accountability for these organizations to monitor stuff better. And before I get a bunch of hate mail, I know this is stupid hard. If someone made a remotely decent tool for doing this type, they would probably be like IPO'd by now, and their butlers would have butlers that also have Lambos. I mean, the modern web experience is one of like a fragile trust, or probably it's more fitting to call it a blind trust. The internet's decentralized nature, built on shared resources like libraries, CDNs, and browser extensions, all are coupled with monetization plays like ad networks, is both a strength and a liability. Sure, more people can see your web pages and developers can earn some money from page visits, but there's no consequences, there's no skin in the game when this all goes belly up. Now, I could spend an entire episode on lack of consequences and thus incentives for companies, especially security companies, to not go fast and break things. But then again, I'm not a 10x developer with the founder's card, so it doesn't really matter. And this brings us to our second point, the flaw in the open source economics model. When burnout hits, how do developers get away from critical pieces of the internet? And I don't have an elegant solution to this, but I think it could be a mixture of things depending on the project and the impact to the web. Corporate sponsorships could be on the table. Government grants and crowdfunding could be viable. But all of them have downsides and aren't really predictable. You could start charging for the service. I mean, personally, I like the Linux Foundation's Open Source Security Foundation, the Open SSF. The cert signing tools and their efforts towards like stopping the impact of software supply chain attacks is a step in the right direction. But this has multiple issues like those present in AI today. Who should own AI? Large corporations who need to monetize the experience, which will probably be ads. Foundations. Well, then how do you attract top talent? And what if the foundation has different goals or values than you, the users? Is it okay for them to censor your results or push their message? Is that something you want? Open source sounds good until you have to fund it, which Meta is doing with the Llamas project. And that sounds awesome until you realize that you need to be a billionaire to make that model work. And I think the likely answer is a mixture of them all. Balance it out. However, moving on, I want to talk about the third point. And I touched on this earlier, but there's ripe opportunities for like CI/CD pipeline scanners to at least map and possibly monitor these shared resources. By all measurable impact, this incident was rather minor. But had this been some type of ransomware or like a wiper worm, something really nasty, things could be obviously much worse. And I get it. I'm biased. I run script blockers, Node.js, and I think the entire dynamic infrastructure of the internet is not worth the trouble it causes. I'm tired of trying to read stuff in between ad pop-ups, cookie opt-outs, subscription notifications, and every time I scroll up or down, it just does it again. But then again, my personal page is pretty much HTML and CSS, and I think I'm in the minority for that one. And the fourth one is a broader national security geopolitics question. When should foreign businesses be allowed to operate in the United States, and at what level? What about if the project is used by many sensitive organizations? What if the data is sensitive? Now, I don't think 23andMe should be allowed to store data, or at a minimum, they should make that information more explicit that they're storing your genetic information. But broadly speaking, do you think genetic information from millions of people should fall into the hands of a hostile nation? Probably not. But then again, my opinions really don't matter, as I'm just a dude talking into a microphone that calls himself a part-time podcaster. And with that, I think this is a great place to wrap this one up. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and review it on your favorite social networks, YouTube, or in your podcast player of choice. And that doesn't have to be like an or, it can be an and. You could do all of those things, and that would be awesome. I also have a mailing list at IntrusionsInDepth.com where you can get notifications in your inbox as well as subscriber-only content like AMA calls. Now, the growth of this podcast is a byproduct of users like you sharing it with your network. And thank you. It means a lot that you've taken time out of your busy life to listen to what I have to say for an hour or so. And for the Intrusions in Depth podcast, I'm Josh Stepp. Thanks for listening.
Crank the volume!